What I want to talk to you tonight is about some work that we've been doing. We've actually been involved in this particular site at Swartigill, just south of Wick, for a number of years now, as you'll see in just a minute. I want to give a bit of a background to those excavations and then talk about this year's excavations in 2021, when we resumed excavation this year after a bit of a gap, obviously, as so many field projects had, based on the inevitability of dealing with COVID, I'm afraid. So it's going to be a bit of a run through, a bit descriptive here and there, but I want to pause now and then to just try to extract some wider significance, broader meaning, and try to give a sense of maybe some of the significance of some of the findings so far. The other thing that I should reiterate, though, at this stage is that our most recent season just finished in September there. Oh, folks, maybe if you could remember to mute yourselves when you're not. Hi. Sorry, folks, if you could just maybe remember to mute yourself when you're not actually contributing, because it creates quite a bit of noise like that. Just a second ago, that was grand. Thanks very much. Yes, so what I was saying was we just completed the most recent field excavation just a few weeks ago. So the findings that I'm going to talk to you about this evening from that excavation season are a bit preliminary, and we will undertake a substantial amount of post-excavation work between now and next season. So there's a little bit more of a story to come, no doubt, from the post-excavation work that we'll do on the back of the materials wrested from the site this season. So our major partner in all this is the Yarrows Heritage Trust, and indeed the landowner at Swartigill themselves, Isla MacLeod and family. And in terms of the excavation work, it has to be said, and I want to acknowledge from the outset that if it'll ever move on, my slides have stuck for a second, no doubt. There we go. I have to acknowledge from the outset my pleasure in telling you about the activities of this man, who's Rick Barton, who's a colleague of mine in the Archaeology Institute, and who for the last few seasons has been effectively directing the excavation in the field while I manage it and drop in to give my supposed Iron Age wisdom on proceedings. And really it's at least a double team of he and myself, and ultimately others, that will bring this to a wider understanding, a better, more detailed understanding. But Rick's doing a grand job in the field and wanted to acknowledge that from the outset. Here's the location, if you were in any doubt where Caithness is. And for that matter, maybe more legitimately, you might have some slight doubt as to where Swartigill is. Swartigill is a site that lies less than a couple of kilometres away from the village of Thrumster itself, just south of Wick. So it's in quite boggy ground in a sedimentary geological landscape of largely the kind of Caithness sandstone. And the specific location of the site is on the very edge of a stream bed, a burn. And indeed, if we go back to the very beginning of our story of site discovery, back in 2004, that's exactly that stream is exactly the mechanism by which we know of the site indeed. So back then in 2004, archaeologists like Paul Humphrey, the late Paul Humphrey, and others involved in that landscape and working with Yarrows Heritage Trust began to realise that there were materials and structural features eroding out on the side of the burn. And here's a shot shortly after on the left. Here's a shot of some excavation work that was undertaken shortly after that recognition to broaden out and create a bit of an apron of a trench just beyond the area of the stonework that was being revealed by the erosional action of the burn or the stream. Here's a shot of what that looked like before excavation as well. And you can see some pretty chunky stonework as well as coarse masonry. And one of the things that really drew attention, in fact, and really kind of crystallised the willpower to do something more with this site, was that sundry fragments, sherds of ceramic, were found, particularly in this location and to the west of it. And those sherds looked for all the world like Iron Age style ceramic, Middle Iron Age style decorated pottery that was kind of semi-diagnostic to within a few centuries at any rate of a period crossing the early to Middle Iron Age. So that's very, very exciting. was a bit of work done, as I say, to broaden out the area, to try to make some sense of what was going on there in the area just beyond the coastal erosion. It wasn't really until 2014 that ourselves and the UHI became involved in the excavation, and initially that was in the form of geophysics to try to undertake some remote sensing survey in the area of the site itself. And here's some shots of them doing that survey, and it allows me to pause just for a second to further characterise the landscape setting here. You get quite a decent sense of the kind of what I've described here as a landscape pocket. It's quite set down, it's quite unobtrusive, the location of the site, and it sits within a small, relatively narrow floodplain or miniature floodplain and glacial shallow valley or vale sitting there around the burn of Swartigill. So in the front of this image here, you can see some of the structural remains that were eroding out the side of the burn, and you can see that quite flat, level, little miniature floodplain, and then the terrace on the opposite side. You get a sense of the scale of that from the survey equipment and the other materials that are on the top of that bank there, and the figures of the geophysicists doing their work there in the little floodplain lit itself. And so the interesting thing about this site from the outset is if it was to be Iron Age, as we suspected from the ceramics, and if there was a relatively well-preserved dry stone structure or structures there, the question really on our minds was what sort of a structure, because it certainly didn't occupy a kind of classic and almost stereotypical or archetypal position in the landscape that you might expect the very well-known brochs to occupy, where you would normally expect them to be very prominent, very substantial, probably commandeering a vantage point in the landscape that was very dominating. That would be the kind of archetypal view of where you might expect to see a broch. And the pottery from the site that had leaked out of the coastal erosion was itself of a type that you could equate to the Broch period. In fact, as I'll show shortly, some of that very similar type of ceramic had actually come out of the excavations at the Broch at Thrumster House itself, excavated by AOC. I'll show some shots of that later on. So this was very mouth-watering, but also very interesting in terms of how do we fit this into the scheme, what's going on here, and raising the potential for exploring an Iron Age site that isn't a broch. And as anyone knows, if anyone does know anything about the Scottish Atlantic Iron Age, it's that brochs have dominated our studies. There's been more ink spilled over brochs than almost any other kind of Iron Age site, or probably any kind of prehistoric site for that matter, in Scottish archaeology. So the opportunity to refresh ourselves with a sampling of a site that might not be a broch was perhaps a very welcome one from my own point of view. In those early stages of excavation, we also did some environmental work as well. So this is my colleague on the right, Dr. Scott Timpany, in the Archaeology Institute, going out and coring into the landscape. The boggy, wet kind of surroundings of the landscape encouraged us to think that we might well encounter the survival of soils, paleo soils, pollen preservation. If we could extract a core, we might get some evidence for the environmental potential of that landscape. And while we haven't given up on that idea, nevertheless, our early attempts to try to locate decent preserved paleo soils in the wider environment came to not very much. And I think a large part of this is to do with the glacial and then the subsequent alluvial action of that floodplain, and how that has tended to effectively strip out soils in most parts of that little low valley. More on that in a little while. In 2014, we did this geophysical survey that I mentioned already as a sort of precursor to any intrusive work that we might undertake. Here's a shot of Thomas de Salle, formerly of the Archaeology Institute UHI Geophysics Unit, and there he's been ably assisted, as across so many of the pieces of work by Isla MacLeod herself and the late Paul Humphrey there, and there they're undertaking resistivity survey to try to broaden out from the frontage of the burn and see what site might lie there. And indeed, this gradiometer or magnetometry survey did come up with a certain amount of goods. So here's plots. Here's the burn of Swartigill itself running through. Here's some of the magnetic signatures. So we can see there's clearly enhancement, and it very much is clustered and localized around erosion front. These two red areas here are where the main eroded remains were evident from the riverine, if I can put it in such posh terms, the riverine erosion of the burn. And this is the interpretation plot on the right hand side here. So a variety of different kinds of strengths of signals and anomalies evident in it, but certainly it looked very much an anthropogenic, that's to say derived from human interactions, kind of a set of materials. And just a hint of things to the north of the burn, the north of the stream as well, where the ground rises quite considerably and where it suggested that there may well be post-medieval rural settlement in the vicinity as well. And then we also did resistivity survey at that time. So the resistance survey tends to pick up more evidence of structural remains in the form of walls, in the form of buried cut features like ditches, gullies, posts, pits, that kind of thing. But certainly very much shows kind of evidence of structural remains. And here, lo and behold, in a very similar position to that cluster that was evident in the magnetometry, here you could see pretty substantial and fairly kind of discrete geophysical entity. I say discrete, but pretty large as well, quite a number of meters across, maybe 30 odd meters across from one length of this kind of axis here. And in the early days of looking at that geophysics, we kind of said to ourselves, well, what's going on here? Is this a couple of structures? Is this one structure? Are we lucky enough to have encapsulated an entire building, maybe even with a central hearth or some other stone setting, perhaps slap bang in the centre? If so, is this some sort of long rectilinear structure? And when you start thinking in those terms, and you're thinking about the Iron Age in Caithness, one of the old favourites quickly raises its head, and that's the so-called wags, not wives and girlfriends of footballers, I should add, but in fact a type of settlement known from the post-Brock stages of the Iron Age in the north of Scotland, and particularly richly dotted across the landscapes of Caithness. And these are often rectangular structures. The most famous of them all, and really the type site, would be the Wag of Force, excavated initially in the early 20th century, with a mixture of results in terms of clarity and ambiguities about what these wags actually are. So it's a type of site that archaeologists have recognised for quite a while, and it's always one that you think might rear its head in a Caithness context. But on the other hand, we were also reflecting, as I said already, reflecting on the fact that there's really quite a substantial set of anomalies. So there's a question mark over that, and when there are such question marks, in my book at any rate, one of the only things that's left to do is have a bit of a dig. So that's what we did from 2015 onwards. And in that first season, again, as ever, we were ably abetted by volunteers, by community, by Yarrow's Heritage Trust. There's Paul Humphrey in the background. I'm delighted to say he got a bit of a bite of the cherry before he passed away, sadly. After that, and so he was able to get a sense and some gratification and satisfaction, and so were we very much able to gratify ourselves with connecting through from that previous coast riverine erosion front on the burn side, and a little bit, and you can see just how modest this excavation really was, and it was modest in scale and duration as well as in terms of the extent of the trench. We were getting features coming through for sure, and those were very useful and interesting to take stock of and to note. And we were able to explore areas within the makeup of the what was really quite difficult to interpret and to understand set of structural remains. But we were able to identify areas that were more waterlogged and affected by flooding. You can see some of that kind of grey kind of material in the centre there that was hovering around this dip in the structural remains, and we were able to explore that in a bit of detail. So I'll show you some pictures of that in just a minute. Very satisfyingly, we were able to connect through some of the archaeology and the features found in the burn side with some of the materials running back from that, including stone walls that had previously been close to where that initial large pottery spread had been located, on the burn front, which I'd showed previously. And we were able to really confirmed the stratigraphic connections between what was going on behind in the main part of the site and the erosion front, based on the fact you could just squint, you can just about see a little miniature scale set in there. It's easier to see in this photo on the right hand side here, and you can see just a few of the sherds of pottery that were coming up, and it was indeed very easy to tell that it was very similar sort of material. It's this Middle Iron Age style pottery. It's a slightly everted rim. That's to say the rim swings out, and then it has these little segments, almost like little sausages, of finger impressions just underneath the rim. A very characteristic type of largely Middle Iron Age style ceramic. You know, the last few centuries BC, maybe the first century or two of the millennium AD. Oh, bit of a ring there going on. So material culture coming up from the site. Hopefully somebody can mute that that incoming call. That would be grand. Thank you. And you can see some material culture coming up from the site in these early stages, and other materials like this is a little rather unprepossessing, but believe me, this is a shot of an in situ saddle quern rubber, so the top stone for a saddle quern, and there was a number of others of these found on site in these early stages of the excavation. The kind of thing that turns up within sites where there's a domestic occupation during the Iron Age and where they're processing cereals, grinding grain to produce flour for baking bread and other bran foodstuffs and the like, and possibly also grinding other substances and materials as well. So getting indications of something of the character of the site in these early stages, and also getting a sense of maybe some of the duration from the artifact. So, for instance, this artifact itself was a whetstone of a kind of schistose variety, a kind of grey schistose type of whetstone, which we've seen quite a lot of in excavations in Orkney and in Shetland. And it's the type of material that's probably been imported from Scandinavia. And this particular whetstone, you could see the last scratchings, the last iron stains on it from where it had actually been used to sharpen and grind an edge, probably an iron blade of some description, probably a little knife. And it's the type of object, the type of tool that's found in Viking period, Norse period sites. And just found, you know, in a rather superficial context on site, but certainly maybe given that a bit of a whiff of the Viking, which might actually entertain and please Colleen, who's the next speaker on tonight. He's going to be talking about things probably nicer, grander Viking objects than that, but it still will interest her, no doubt. The other sort of lesson that we learned from the early seasons as well, and boy did we learn it in terms of our own backs as we bent to excavate the site, was just how much alluvial action has impacted on the site, and it had capped and sealed. We're talking about alluvial flooding, or the flooding of the burn, and the ingress of water into the site and into that floodplain, and it bringing with it particles of material, quite hard material that accretes as a kind of almost, in some cases, almost a hard pan of material that caps the site and the excavations. And you know, we did have early on, we had worries that might actually, that action of alluvial material had actually sluiced out deposits and removed the kind of lovely, if you will, the soft tissue that we seek to find, to flesh out the bones of the architecture of the buildings themselves. And the site had clearly been wet at times. We thought it probably had been wet at times during the Iron Age and prehistory, as well as subsequent to that, as well as capping the site thereafter. And it might even be possible. Oh, I'm getting a bit of a reverb, folks. I think someone else has got their mic open, so it's causing a little bit of distortion. So if you could remember to mute yourselves if possible, that's grand. Thank you. And so dampness was a problem on this site, perhaps in antiquity, as today, perhaps sometimes. And I talked about this kind of grey silted kind of material that seemed to be emanating from this kind of movement of water across the site. And when we excavated through that, we did in the first seasons, we were finding features like this drain-like structure sitting underneath the base of a passageway, and running along the length of and parallel to and central to that passageway, and more on that in a moment, but it looked like this kind of feature was designed to aid and abet the community to perhaps keep the settlement dry. However, even in these early stages, we were sort of saying to ourselves, well, it doesn't actually look like the drain is coming from the site and emptying into the burn, but actually, counterintuitively, running in the opposite direction. It looked like the gradient of the drain, if anything, was running in towards the site from the direction of the water in the burn. And that is somewhat, or was somewhat, perplexing and a bit curious and a bit strange. So more on that just shortly. So at the conclusion of some of the later seasons, we were able to sort of, look at this kind of jumble of remains. We were able to identify structural elements from rubble elements and infill elements, but it wasn't really clear what was going on site. And it does take a bit of time to develop and kind of mature these excavations, and particularly dealing with even relatively complex stony structures that have had quite a duration and a lifetime and a biography of use on those sites, as it were, because that complexity is a double-edged sword. It's lovely for building a story and understanding a site in terms of its phases, but on the other hand, it also complicates and sometimes compromises some of the earlier stages. So, it's just that part of that double-edged sword that we get with well-preserved archaeology. As we expanded in subsequent seasons, we were able to get a bit more clarity in 2017, and in later seasons, we were able to broaden out again and get a sense of these paved areas and the passageway that it sat within, and curvilinear walls like this one here. You can see the wall face there appeared to very much match to some of the geophysics. Just slightly shifting over that image slightly to see that more of that paved area and this passageway and this kind of rubble dump construction or very coarse masonry, and big upright blocks of stonework set in to form one side of that passage. All looked a bit odd, all looked a bit interesting. And in subsequent seasons, we were able to match things through to some of the early geophysics. So this trench expanded, and here's how it equates to the site plan, and you can get a sense of the structural elements and that passageway, which we term structure A, and this wall, which is part of structure B, as we termed it. And we were also able to obtain some radiocarbon dates, which is always a good thing. And these are preliminary dates for the site, and they did indeed match to the Middle Iron Age, or the tail end of the early Iron Age into the Middle Iron Age, maybe on the cusp of the traditional boundary between the two, and gave us a sense of what we were looking at least for a small volume of the events on the site. We're only really dating a couple of contextual events here, so we're well aware of the fact that the site might well run on before that and after that, and we were only getting a snapshot of chronology, but a snapshot is good enough in those early stages, and certainly good enough to confirm some of the Iron Age suppositions that we were making, including also dating the deposit that the pottery came from as well, which is also really important, because it's often, or it's far too seldom, I should say, that artifactual materials have actually been dated independently beyond the typologies and the classifications of them themselves. Here's, excuse me, those dates presented in a slightly different format, and you get a sense that there is actually a reasonable time span across those two date points, those two date ranges, those two peaks, going from at earliest, in the 300s BC, the earlier 300s BC, to out to the sort of 50s BC or thereabouts in terms of that overall range. And the geophysics, we're always mindful of, I hate the expression, but always mindful of trying to ground truth geophysics, and that certainly was something that we were able to do based on some of those early seasons, and to sort of plot out our trenches against that set of geophysics and see, while we really were realising how large the features in the geophysics were when it came to actually plotting the trench against them, because we already were hypothesising that structure B was a roundhouse of sorts, a Middle Iron Age or early to Middle Iron Age roundhouse. But when you plot it out against the geophysics, you get a sense of just how small that structure is relative to the overall impression of the geophysics or extent of the geophysics. So there's clearly a lot more going on site than that. And those dates, radiocarbon dates and the pottery, etc., also are very mouth-watering, because if you excuse me for a minute, I've drawn an example from my other research excavations at the cairns in South Ronaldsay and Orkney. One of the things that allows us to think about and think our way into is the wider Broch landscapes. Those radiocarbon dates and the ceramic material that I mentioned already were giving us a sense that the site is
I think we might have lost Martin. I don't know if anyone else has lost him too, but hopefully he'll be back in a minute. We'll just wait and see if he comes back to us.
Okay.
So, for example, apparel and footwear are really suffering right now because of COVID.
I think everyone is trying to leave and rejoin, which is maybe a good plan, but I think maybe it's Martin that's got the problem just now. We're just hoping he'll be back to us. And, oh, you're back. Hello. Sorry we lost you away for a minute.
Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, my apologies too. Somehow managed to drop out there. So hopefully, hopefully you're seeing that. No, I don't know. You are actually right now. Hold on.
We've not got your slideshow up just now.
Yeah, I'll try and get that back. Hold on a sec. Here we go. Yeah, it's not playing ball right now, but we'll force the issue with it in a second.
It was that lovely Broch, I think, blew everyone's mind.
It blew the top off the whole event, sadly. Are you sort of seeing it now? Yeah.
I'm not seeing anything yet.
It might be wiping its feet. Still nothing? No.
Not yet. If anyone is seeing it, you may be quicker than me. Oh, someone's saying yes. Someone's seeing it. Maybe it's just me.
Anyone? No. Everyone? Is that,
No, we've not got it here.
So it's kind of showing up.
Yeah, some people are seeing it. Some people have some lovely fast Wi-Fi, but it looks like most people not yet. But I think we'll take positive that it will be coming then.
Fingers crossed. Okay, for those of you that can see the image, hopefully those that can remember that last image that I showed, hopefully. And that was just a shot of the excavations at the cairns. And the point I was trying to make simply was this, that at the cairns, we're not just interested in the Broch, we're interested in the wider landscape. And in that wider landscape, we've undertaken geophysical survey and we've done some trial trenching. And we know that there's a predecessor settlement there that predates the Broch community, the Broch site there. And that may be ancestral in that sense to the Broch. And what I'm suggesting is that in order to understand Brochs, we kind of have to understand the context within which they emerge. And at Swartigill also, we have that potential to hopefully understand the context by which Brochs are developing and evolving. So that's, on the one hand, that's me paying my dues to Broch studies again, and I've already reiterated previously that we would like to be able to look at a wider range of settlement forms in the Iron Age and not just obsess purely over Brochs. But nevertheless, one of the significant aspects of a site like Swartigill is it gives us the power to peer into a non-Broch settlement, which is at least contemporary with the period that Brochs are evolving in the north of Scotland, but also may well date back in time to before that point in time as well. So it's inherently worth looking at it for its own sake, but also potentially gives us the power to ask questions about the circumstances societally, politically, economically, ideologically, even ritually, as to how Brochs came about. And in the context of Swartigill itself, and hopefully more people are starting to see the images appearing now. Is that true, Kirsty, or not? Maybe.
Yes, they're all back now.
Oh, good stuff. Excellent. In the context of Swartigill, that's also true because here, of course, you can see the aforementioned excavations at Thrumster House. and a wonderful bit of work this was as well by AOC Archaeology. And here's the excavation, or here's the cleared entranceway. Here's some sections of the masonry you can see from that nice aerial shot. You get a sense of the dominating or dominating position of the Broch in the landscape, which contrasts quite a lot with what I mentioned about Swartigill's setting, of course. And they also obtained radiocarbon dates from the Thrumster House Broch, and dates that are quite similar to the dates that we've got from Swartigill, from the early dates we got at Swartigill. And here's some of the ceramics sequence that we've got from the Thrumster excavations. And the one at the top here, so-called Type A, is incredibly similar to the ceramics that were found that first alerted folks to there being a prehistoric site at Swartigill itself. And it's that type of ceramic there from Swartigill. So all good stuff, and merely bring that out to suggest a sort of first departure point where we can say, well, this site has the potential to really open up significant areas of discussion about the Caithness Iron Age and about how the sequence and about how the story of Brochs emerges in that part of the world. The other thing that was really significant from recent excavations from last season as well as this most recent season, we were able to actually critically evaluate the condition of the deposits as well. And we were able, thankfully, to say that there was good survival and there was preservation of in situ so-called soft deposits, floors, occupation material, evidence of inhabitation and detritus from those practices and everyday activities that were underway within the structures. And we had fretted and worried and been anxious slightly that the action of the fluvial alluvial stuff had actually maybe sluiced out that kind of deposit, but nope. In the centre of the so-called structure B, kind of roundhouse structure, we had deposits set within the hearth, amongst other sort of rake-out deposits surrounding the hearth. And this is a late hearth in the building, and it's not the most beautiful stone setting, arguably, but then it is uppermost in the sequence and may well have been compromised. The other kind of useful and interesting thing was the more aspects of the material culture from the early seasons as well. Things like this cannel coal or lignite bangle fragment. We got another one of these this season, actually, strangely enough, to the north of the burn, so on the other side, in a test pit on the other side of the burn. But these are objects that have quite a wide currency in circulation, and they're running from at least sort of Middle Bronze Age through into probably the early historic period, the early medieval period. And the other thing from the site of things like this, evidence that there's actually items which are rather unprepossessing, but is I can assure you, is a nice little bronze object, a copper alloy object that is a little setting, which may have housed a little inlay of glass or enamel paste, a colourful contrast to the lustrous bronzy colour that this object would have had when it was in its primary use. Another intriguing aspect of the site is the presence of what may be, just maybe, funerary activity. And funerary activity in the Iron Age is pretty rare, and formalised burial is even more rare, and it's very difficult to sort of establish and ascertain what you might call a normative burial tradition for the Iron Age. So anytime you get even a whiff of potential funerary activity, that's very, very important on an Iron Age site. Interestingly, though, this may not even be Iron Age. This is at the front of the site, close to the burn, partially compromised by the action of the erosion, and it's a stone-lined box. And there was just a few fragments of burnt bone that we excavated from the fill of this stony structure, but many more may have come out of there and been dislocated or spread or compromised and moved around. More on that possibility in just a moment or two. So we come up to date, 2021 season, and a much broader area, a much larger area to encapsulate, to make content, to put into context the slightly more limited findings that we've had previously. So, for instance, structure B, that kind of roundhouse, that sort of roundhouse, which is really very curvilinear and neat and well built on the north side of that structure, as you can see from this lovely curving wall, very Iron Agey in feel, but then much more ambiguous and sinuous and amorphous elsewhere, so given a kind of a more irregular overall shape and form. There's that upper late central hearth within that building as well. And this is at an earlier season, so it's possible this season to really get a much stronger sense of the overall form and shape of that structure. And here's a beautiful aerial photograph, a really exquisite aerial photograph by Angus Mackay. So thank you to him for that this season, 2021. And in this, you can see structure B here, rather odd sort of roundhouse. Structure A is the souterrain. It's got a kind of golf club shaped existence in plan with that terminal chamber and this curving passage, curving against the direction of the sun, as it were. Structure C, a rectilinear building, a rectangular building, rather an odd and interesting feature, to say the least. And structure D, which comprised in previous seasons, was this stretch of curvilinear wall. More on that to come. And here's if we reposition and we reorientate that image so that north's at the top, you can get a sense of structure. The souterrain is in the north, structure B to its south, structure D's and structure C to the south of those indeed, and then the burn front, the erosion front up here. Structure D, as I mentioned, what previously looked quite sinuous, quite difficult to establish what it really was, but actually there's an awful lot more to this structure we discovered this season. We're only really scratching the surface, as it were, but there's an awful lot more to come. And we could review the early geophysics yet again to take stock of that again. So structure D would effectively be in this position in the geophysics. And lo and behold, this season, maybe you can make it out. I'll employ a device in a second to illustrate it. But there's more of a curve to this building and more of an extensive curve to the south part of the building. And you can see kind of differential drying up here. That's usually a sure sign that there's masonry or stonework just under the surface. So while we didn't get to fully excavate that this season, nevertheless, that's to come almost certainly. And so it takes on a very regular roundhouse. This time there could be little doubt that it's a very roundhouse in the sort of half of it that we can so far see. And that explains probably why structure B is so irregular and odd, because effectively structure B has been tacked on, this portion has been tacked on to the outside wall of structure D. And structure D is therefore a roundhouse that's even earlier than that tail end of the early Iron Age, middle Iron Age bracket that we would give structure B on the basis of the radiocarbon dates. So that's really interesting, because that potentially that early roundhouse could be stretching back into the later Bronze Age. And in Caithness terms, those are rarer than hen's teeth in terms of the late Bronze Age houses that have been explored properly and thoroughly in the modern era. That would be very, very good news for us indeed. And while it's still a bit conjectural, we hope that radiocarbon dates that we obtain in the next few months will bear that out. Also visible in that and in the midst of structure D is a sort of extended remains related to structure C being the rectangular building in theory that we're catching the L shape of in one corner, and its remains were projecting right into structure D. But I think stratigraphically they predate structure D, the structure D roundhouse. So that in itself is really interesting, because what it looks like is the builders of the early roundhouse were quite content to leave at least the stunted remains of that predecessor building, the structure C, running at least in part through the midst of their living quarters in their floor space, right through the middle of that house. Now that might sound a bit odd, but when you take on board the fact that builders and inhabitants of roundhouses and brochs have frequently left areas of bedrock and even the remains of earlier structures and features still visible and to some extent reused within the midst of their buildings, then it starts to make a little bit more contextual sense. And it may well be that there's a very intentional referencing of the past involved in these remains being left, at least in part, within the centre of the structure D roundhouse. However, it doesn't take a genius to then say to yourself, well, if stratigraphically structure C is earlier than D and D is earlier than B, then what date does that make structure C? And that's a $64,000 question for us to pursue quite avidly before too long. But certainly these two structures are fascinating. I'll come back to C in just a minute. there's the souterrain. We got a full extent of it this year in 2021 with that terminal chamber, this curvilinear passage, that drain set down into the floor of the thing, well, maybe we'll leave it to the Q&A to raise the question of why that drain is running the strange way that it is in the gradient. But certainly from the excavation this year, we could reflect on the mixed materials of construction, upright panels, coarse masonry, kind of almost rubble dump masonry in some parts as well. So a kind of a slight mixture of materials and methods for its construction, which is quite common with souterrains, these underground passageways of the Iron Age, sometimes thought of as storage devices, sometimes other explanations are evoked for them. There's the kind of the formality of the interior. The drain is very well laid. If the walls are a bit odd, then the drain is very well constructed. The threshold slab connecting the area between the passageway and the main chamber. Here's another view of some of these big blocks of masonry. And some of these, in fact, we could see strange marks on some of these, very faint linear marks, not at all unlike some of the kind of very faint incised lines that you get on some of the Neolithic monuments, like, for instance, some of the monuments in Orkney or indeed the Nessa Brodgar excavations currently underway. There's another couple of views of that souterrain structure. I won't go into the detail because I could be here all year talking about the function of souterrains, but nevertheless, it's worthwhile, or it's useful to bear in mind that the consensus has been storage and a connection with the productive capacity of a community. And on that note, we find more and more of these querns, these elements, or these tools that are used for processing cereals. So it really does look like there's a kind of farmstead-like set of activities underway on the site, which is, of course, interesting, but also very, very redolent of the Iron Age more generally. So there's that kind of quite relatively prosaic set of activities on the one hand, but there's also this really interesting way in which the site is using and reusing earlier remains potentially. Structure C I mentioned already and showed you how that's been incorporated arguably within Structure D. One of the interesting things about Structure C that's been visible all along is this panel of masonry in one end of that structure, forming a very nice, neat part to the facing of the masonry walls. And in this one, you can see, and you can see even more clearly in this shot, that beautiful ripple effect that is basically inherent in the geology. It's fossil beach, effectively. And it wouldn't be unlike the builders of stalled cairns in both a Caithness and a Highland and an Orkney context to use very aesthetically pleasing or perhaps symbolically significant stone types in positions within the build of chambered cairns and stalled cairns and the like. So we cannot yet prove it, but we do know that building is early in the site sequence. We do know that it has a strange architectural style to it, which is rectilinear at odds with a kind of general curvilinear architecture seen elsewhere or elsewhen on the site. And we do know that the building has been incorporated into that early roundhouse. So it's not impossible that we are dealing with a funerary monument of a much earlier period, and that the Iron Age and later prehistoric elements of the site have positioned themselves perhaps deliberately vis-a-vis these earlier remains. And that would be a familiar thing to see, again, for instance, in an Orcadian context or within a context of South Uist Iron Age sites, which also have this tendency to revisit much earlier sites, monuments and landscapes. Something I can tell you very little about, because none of us can say much about, is the southwest corner. So in the excavations this year, we could see there's some pretty substantial remains on one flank of the area of Structure D, probably covering Structure D, so later than it, and quite substantial walls and built elements, but we've very, very little to go on in terms of understanding what was going on there up in that corner there of the site. But it is something that we'll return to in future seasons, along with some of the other elements. Just finally, you'll be glad to know, I just want to talk about a return to the burn front. We were able to see this year that there was a prepared surface. Sometimes we've previously encountered heat affected materials on that burn frontage, but we know that there's a kind of prepared surface. We know that there's a kind of almost a raft of slabs and soft clay materials that are set down on top of the natural glacial clay along the front of the burn. It looks quite formal. It looks quite structured. It's very, very deliberate and very set and settled. And from that same context, or in the set of contexts that surround the pottery spread and the previous kist excavation, we were finding much larger pieces of burnt bone this year, including ball joint bones, which we cannot, because it's carbonized and heavily calcined, we can't absolutely 100% suggest that that's human bone, but it is high temperature burnt bone, and it could very well be. It's the right shape, size for the elements of human ball joints. So watch this space. We will endeavour to confirm that one way or another. And what that means is that we might well be looking at a kind of funerary activity both on the north and the south edges of the site, and then the later prehistoric set of domestic houses imposed effectively into the middle of that, maybe several centuries or millennia later on. More of that pottery, oodles of it coming out of that coastal zone, out of the burn zone, and more of that very same sort of pottery, and probably the same vessel. And this time with lots of residue on it, which will be really interesting to, if we can do some residue analysis on that in the next few months as well. And again, just to reiterate that point, the green stuff are these kind of potential funerary or earlier prehistoric activities fringing the site, north and south, and then the imposition of this later set of remains in the centre of it. So if there's anything I want to say in closing, apart from the thank yous and the acknowledgements in just a second, it would be this. It's that this is a really mouth-watering set of remains on this site. It's a wonderful addition to the archaeology of Caithness. It can help us to debate and to discuss some of the wider issues in the Iron Age, but more broadly beyond that, in prehistory in general, maybe even into the early historic period if the Viking ephemera turn out to be properly in situ as well. We've got that sense of a very substantial domestic occupation from maybe as early as the late or the Middle Bronze Age through to the Middle Iron Age, and then these other sorts of activities and contexts that fringe them on the margins. So in one trench, we've got that capacity potentially to peer into thousands of years of human activity in this little site, tucked away in its unobtrusive little pocketed landscape in Caithness. So other than that, it just remains to say thank you to partners and funders, principally Yarrows Heritage Trust, but also these funding bodies who assisted us this year on site. Thank you to previous funders and generations of community diggers season upon season. And thank you also to everyone who visited the site, including groups of school parties. And last and certainly not least, thank you to I.L. MacLeod, the landowner, and her family for their ongoing hospitality, which goes above and beyond the call of any duty, and which really does put a smile on our face when we return to this landscape again and again and again, as we will do, we hope, in the future to come. Okay, I'll shut up and let us move on then from there. Thank you.